You might have heard the phrase disagree and commit. It's been used as a core principle in loads of tech companies like Amazon, Netflix, and Intel. But what does it actually mean and how does it work? In this video, I'm going to explain. Hey, how's it going? This is Scruffy Leadership, a YouTube channel about management and leadership aimed particularly at software engineers. My name's Ben, and I've been a leader and a manager in the tech industry for over 25 years. The idea behind disagree and commit is really pretty simple. When a decision is being made, there should be a phase during which debate happens, meaning people can disagree openly. And then once the decision is made, everyone should commit to the decision. So, for example, you might be running a meeting with your team debating the question of whether to increase your sprints from 2 weeks to 3 weeks. Maybe it's your proposal, but you want to hear the team's views before making the final decision. The key thing here is that you really do want to hear everyone's views. No one should feel like their voice won't be heard, that they'll be shouted down or laughed at or just ignored. So it all starts with psychological safety. In other words, your team members need to feel safe to say what they really think without fear. If you don't have good psychological safety, you can't expect the disagree and commit idea to work. Okay, let me just say that again, because I think this point is often missed by leaders. If you expect your team to disagree and commit, you first have to make sure you and your team have good psychological safety. If not, you're really just asking them to pretend to agree with something they might not agree with. Okay, so let's assume that you have good psychological safety with your team. By the way, if you're not really sure what that means, I have a video all about it, which I'll link to in the description below. Okay, so you want people to share their real views. Some people will just naturally find this harder if they are disagreeing with you as their manager or leader. So it's really important in this situation that you react in the right ways when that happens. So don't try to argue against them. Don't try to show them why they're wrong. Don't grimace or groan or look away. In short, don't do anything to make them think, I wish I hadn't said that. One good approach is to react the same way to all points, whether you agree with them or not. So nod and say something like, thank you, that's a good point. What do others think? Another important thing is that if someone is not saying anything, you should default to assuming that they disagree with you. So ask them, what are you thinking? And hear what they have to say. This is one of the points of the disagree and commit idea, is to avoid the illusion of consensus. So if you imagine a leader that shares their proposal and asks for views and no one says anything, that leader just assumes that means everyone agrees. In reality, everyone's probably too scared to say anything, to be, the first one to speak up. So no one saying anything is likely a bad sign. So if you find yourself in that situation, well, once again, it might be a sign that your team's psychological safety isn't as good as it should be, which means you have a bigger problem to solve. But at least in that meeting, just be upfront about it, okay? You can say, I'm assuming that the reason no one's saying anything is because you will disagree with me. I'm guessing maybe the reason you disagree is, this or that. Am I right? In the ideal situation, though, most people will say something, especially if they disagree with you. But the key thing is to make sure everyone gets a chance. And by the way, not everyone is comfortable speaking up in a team meeting, which means it's important to offer other ways for people to share their thoughts, maybe one-to-one with you or even in an email or a Slack message, perhaps. Okay, so by the end of the deliberation period, the discussion, which might take multiple meetings, documents, and other discussions, you'll reach a decision. In this case, it is your decision in the example we're using. Now, a few things should be true. So 1, everyone relevant has had their voice heard by you, but also by each other. 2, everyone relevant can understand why and how you reached the decision you did. Maybe they don't understand the minute detail of every single thought process, but it should at least make sense to them. It doesn't mean they're convinced by it, but at least they understand it. 3, everyone who is involved in the discussion either agrees with the decision, or if they don't, then they commit to it. So what does commitment mean here? Well, it means they put their disagreement away and they get on with the job. It means they act as if they agree with the decision, or at least as if their disagreement doesn't affect the way they behave. It doesn't mean lying or putting on a fake smile. It just means being a professional. Most importantly, it means not visibly simmering with rage, not whispering behind your back about what a bad decision it was, not spreading discontent. So in our example, perhaps you decide in the end not to increase sprint lengths because you heard enough compelling arguments against it. Now, the people in your team who were pushing for 3 weeks will have to disagree and commit. So when you're approaching the end of the next sprint, they won't say things like, well, if I'd had my way, we'd still have another week to get this done. They won't roll their eyes when someone mentions the length of the sprint. Doesn't mean they can't ever express disagreement about it, though. It just means that if they do, they should do it in the right way at the right time. One way to make that possible is to agree on a timescale when you make the decision. So you might say, okay, having considered all the arguments, I've decided that we're going to stick with 2-week sprints for now. We'll revisit it in 3 months. It can be really helpful for people to know the timescale, not just, yeah, we might revisit it one day, but we'll specifically revisit it in 3 months. Ideally, then they'll disagree and commit during those 3 months. And when the 3 months are up, they'll either have changed their minds, or if not, they'll have another chance to express their views and influence the decision again. I want to point something out about this particular example scenario. You changed your mind. And you won't always change your mind, of course, but it's important that you do so when the arguments are strong enough, when you get enough data to convince you to change your mind. Otherwise, if you don't, what's the point in people expending energy trying to convince you of their view if they know you'll never change your mind? Some people think changing your mind is a sign of weakness in a leader, but the opposite is true. A weak leader is one who ignores the facts and sticks with their original view, even when that's clearly the wrong thing to do. So in the example I've used so far, you're the decision maker, but just as often you'll be involved in decisions that other people are making. And as a leader, disagreeing and committing is just as important as it is for individual contributors, maybe even more so because of the additional weight your voice carries now that you're a leader. Once again, disagreeing and committing is really only going to be possible if you have good psychological safety, this time with the leader that's making the decision. Perhaps it's your boss. Now, what to do if you don't, if your boss has failed to create a psychologically safe environment for you, is beyond the scope of this video. Let me know if you'd be interested in me making a video on that subject. Okay, so now, if you end up disagreeing and committing, not only will you reflect that in the way you engage with the decision, but you might also have to reflect that back to your team. And this is where it can get tricky. So let's take an example. Your boss is deciding whether to give everyone an extra day off in the summer. Everyone in your team knows it was your idea and that you've really fought for it. In the end, your boss decides against it. And because you have good psychological safety with your boss, you understand the decision and you understand how they reached the decision, even though you still disagree with it. So now, what do you say to your team? Well, you don't want to be dishonest with them. It's no good pretending that the decision was the one you wanted because they know that's not true. So instead, you can be explicit about it. You can say, as you all know, I was supportive of the extra day off, but in the end, having discussed it with my boss, I can see why they decided against it. I'm disagreeing and committing. It's not the decision I would have made, but it does make sense to me. So what not to do here is, honestly, what I think many inexperienced managers and leaders tend to do. They confide fully in their team. They say, my boss is an idiot. They made the wrong choice. It's not my fault. I tried. Now, this might win your team over to you a bit more, but in the long run, what it does is create discord and distrust. Your team will now see themselves a little bit more as being in opposition to your boss rather than all being in the same team together. So no matter how tempted you are to pass the buck in that way, you should avoid doing it. Again, it doesn't mean you lie. It doesn't mean you put on a fake smile. It just means you act professionally. Now, finally, there is a somewhat rare version of disagree and commit that we don't often hear about. Let's imagine your team comes to you with a proposal that you don't like. Perhaps you think it's too risky, but they're very bought into it, and for whatever reason, you decide you're going to allow them to go for it. You can tell them, I disagree and commit. I think this is too risky and it won't work out, but why don't you prove me wrong? I hope you do. So depending on your role and your level and the nature of the organization you work in, it's probably not a good idea to do this too often, because then you're basically abdicating your responsibility to your team. But in some circumstances where you think the benefits outweigh the risks and where you think the downside of failure is capped, and perhaps in cases where you know that your team has a better handle on the full picture than you do, it can be worth taking this approach. When you ask people to disagree and commit, not everyone's going to like it, and that's okay. It's not your job to make everyone happy about everything, although it is part of your job to create an environment in which people can tell you what they're not happy about at work. That's psychological safety. If you want to know more about it and how important it is for team success, check out the video that's on the screen now. And if you have thoughts or questions about disagree and commit, why not let me know in the comments below? And the same goes if you have any ideas for subjects you'd like to see me cover in future videos. Bye. See you soon.